Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian. Hi, hello. I am so excited to talk to everybody today. We're in between official seasons, so we just did a really cool, 4 or 5 weeks on true crime documentaries, because I know you love a good true crime doc, you know I do. And before we start our next series, I have a couple of weeks with a couple of episodes and themes that don't quite fit into that series that are honestly just things I really like that I'm listening to right now. So I'm calling this next couple of weeks series Rebecca's Selects. Think of it as Oprah's favorite things on a much smaller scale. Mostly they're going to be podcasts I'm listening to and possibly a book I'm reading. And these are sincerely things that I'm just a little bit obsessed with. So I'm excited to share those with you. But before we get into that, I do want to announce our latest patrons. I launched Patreon maybe a little over a week ago. And I'm so grateful for everybody who signed up. And I wanted to give a little shout out to the last handful of patrons. I'm humbled. I am just so thankful for the support. So a big heartfelt thank you to the latest diehards, who include Dr. Shiloh. Of course, she is from the LA Not So Confidential podcast. Barbara S., Margot O., Kathy S., Shannon N., and Lance Reinstierna. He gets a full name because, of course, you might know him from Missing Maura Murray and the Crawl Space podcast. So thank you all so much. Your goodies are in the mail. And if you would like to be a patron, if you've been thinking about it, if you've been listening to Dialogue for some time and appreciate the show, the interviews, what you get to learn here, then I would be honored for you to become a diehard. You can go to patreon.com/dialogue, DIEALOGUE, and sign up there. In addition to ad-free episodes, you are also going to get bonus content in the form of a brand new podcast, a new show called Trialogue, a courtroom conversation. I am having so much fun speaking with lawyers and people in the criminal justice system about big headline cases in the news and in the courts. So there's already 2 episodes of Trialogue up there. There's a bonus conversation with my true crime buddy Javier Leyva of Pretend Podcast, and all the ad-free episodes and true crime trivia is coming your way as well. So there's already a lot of good stuff and lots more to come. So please come join the fun. And thank you again to my new patrons. I truly appreciate it. Now, next order of business is CrimeCon. It is in Austin, Texas. I've never been to Texas. I am so excited. Is everything really bigger there? I hope so. It is June 4th, 5th, and 6th. I will be on Podcast Row, and I will also be doing a live podcast and true crime trivia recording. So please, if you're going, come say hi to me. I want to meet you. And if you're not sure, or if you're not sure if you want to travel yet, there are virtual passes still available, and there are also in-person passes still available. You can use my code DIALOGUE21, that's DIALOGUE21, DIEALOGUE, and you can get 10% off any pass you choose. So if you're thinking about it, virtually or in person, I would not hesitate. I've been to one CrimeCon. I went in 2019, and it was just a complete blast. And I think that's about all the news. I am really excited to share with you today's guest. Her name is Dana Goodyear. She's a journalist and a writer for The New Yorker.
I just felt like story. So I didn't think, is this going to be a true crime podcast that can have a more literary kind of flavor and like meander a little bit more? Or is this a literary podcast that's going to be kind of, have some of these sort of investigative elements? I didn't think about it in that way. I did think Malibu Noir.
She is the host, producer, and writer of The Lost Hills. That podcast just came out in March, and it was an 8-part investigative series. And oh my gosh, it was so good. And you'll hear the story that I tell Dana right at the top. I'm dying to tell it to you, but then you'd hear it twice. So I had a very unique listening experience with this show, and I just adored it. I just really, really love this podcast. And if you haven't listened to it, I hope you will go subscribe right now. And you can even go listen and then come listen to our interview, or listen to our interview and then go listen to the podcast, whatever you prefer. But you're going to love this conversation with Dana, who really, her experience is mostly in writing and journalism. But like many people in journalism, You know, a good story is a good story. She has created something really special in the Lost Hills, and I'm excited for you to hear it, and I'm excited for you to hear this conversation. Thank you again to Dana for killing the small talk. Also, stick around to the end to hear a promo for another great podcast called Murder, Murder News. Dana, I am so happy to have you on Dialogue today. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to talk to you.
Oh my gosh, me too. So you're in LA, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm based in New York, but I literally saved your podcast. I've been wanting to listen to it for weeks, but I had a trip planned for Malibu specifically. And I'm a New Yorker, so going to LA anytime for me is very exciting. And we were out looking at Pepperdine for my daughter. And we didn't do any college visits last year because of COVID. So now we're like scrambling because she's been accepted. And we saved Lost Hills for driving around Malibu.
Are you crazy?
Yes, absolutely. I'm crazy. I mean, look, I think people are going to love this podcast wherever they listen to it. But if you happen to be driving around Malibu and listening to it, it creates this whole, because you create the world, right? You don't even need to be there to be in Malibu listening. But when you are, oh my gosh, it was so immersive. And I'm an avid podcast listener. So for me, this was like, it was like my Disney World. It was just like really fun. And my daughter was really into it. And I usually have to reluctantly pull her into my podcast. So I just wanted to share with you that experience because it was so, it was a memory. It's something I think she and I are both going to remember.
I hope it didn't turn her off Pepperdine, which is an excellent school, but it is right there at the mouth of Malibu Canyon Road. I mean, it literally is the turn up into the world away from the coast. You know, the Lost Hills involves the coastal Malibu, but it's really mostly set in this wilderness that you find when you turn north on Malibu Canyon Road.
Oh, yeah, it sure does. I mean, it's not the Malibu everybody thinks of. I think people think of the beach and they think of the billionaires and they think of the celebrities, but there is this wild, there's this whole other world. And you talk about that in the beginning, and I'm already jumping too far ahead. Let's start with, you are a journalist, you're a writer for The New Yorker. Want to hear all about how you got to make a podcast in the first place. But first, why don't you just tell us about your journalism background?
Well, I've been working at The New Yorker since 1995. So it was really the first real job I had out of college, was being an assistant at The New Yorker, which is a very, very lucky turn of events for me. And then I just kind of clung on by my fingernails and eventually moved out here. But when I was in New York, I was, you know, at first I was just doing the assistant type thing and helping out in whatever way anybody asked me to. But I worked for wonderfully low maintenance people who just often would like send me to the library to read everything that I was interested in by Alma Guillermo Prieto or whoever. And just, I got a reading education, a reader's education in the history of the New Yorker, which is one history. I think there are many histories of 20th century American journalism, but the New Yorker is definitely part of that story. And so I got to go very deep, and I got to start editing in little ways. Even if I was just transferring other editors' notes onto one big proof, I got to sort of see the mechanisms, and I learned a lot about writing that way. I think I already thought of myself as a writer, although I had done no professional writing really, maybe a little piece here or there, or an unsigned book review, that kind of thing. But I really wanted to be a writer, and I started to learn to be a writer by editing writers who were incredible writers. So that's sort of my story. And so I worked for 2 nonfiction editors when I was first hired. And then I went to work for David Remnick, who was somewhat new to the editor-in-chief job. It was a couple years into his editorship that I went to work directly for him. And I just, then my learning took on this whole new dimension, and that was an amazing experience. So I started editing and I started writing.
Okay, so for your story around the Malibu Shooter, which is what's centered in this podcast, there's also a piece in The New Yorker about it just last month. Which came first? Were you investigating to write about it and then decided it should be a podcast, or vice versa?
So it was sort of a 1, 2, 3 stage process where I heard about this murder and then learned about the earlier shootings that had gone unreported and that the public wasn't warned about. And I called my editor at the New Yorker and I said, I want to go out there and start reporting. This is a great letter from Los Angeles, letter from Malibu type of thing. At that point, there was no suspect and there was no, there was a murderer at large. And there were people who were still hearing shots in the night. I have close friends who live in a little neighborhood that's right across from the park, and they were calling 911 frequently at night, hearing gunshots. And it was just a very urgent, acute situation. And so I was thinking, well, maybe I'll write a piece for the New Yorker about this, about what's happening in Malibu right now. And we sort of talked about how you do that when there's no resolution. My editor and I, they didn't know who had done this. There was no idea who had done it. And it was all happening in the present tense. So we thought maybe, this is a series of web dispatches where you can do something that's sort of serialized on the web in a way that the printed magazine doesn't really allow for anymore in a way, because we had this kind of other medium or other format, the website that can do that. So we talked about doing that. And after we got off the call in which I had pitched / agreed to do it that way, I called him back. Maybe it was even the same day and said, actually, I want to do this as a podcast. And
wow.
So I had no idea what I was talking about when I said that. I just really like listening to podcasts. And so he said, well, I don't know anything about podcasts, but here, the New Yorker has a radio show. Maybe someone over there knows what to do. And they introduced me to Ben Adair at Western Sound, who is my producer and partner in this project. And before Pushkin came on as another partner later on, but Ben and I just met up out there, and he had done some stuff in Malibu previously also, and we were just off to the races. We both saw immediately the story wouldn't be best served by being one episode dropped somewhere. It had this kind of, like, we went down the rabbit hole right away, and then we felt that we would like to take everybody else along with us. So
absolutely. That's so interesting. So would this have been like 2018, early 2018? Okay.
Yeah, this is the summer, late summer, early fall of 2018. So within a couple of weeks of my meeting Ben and starting my first recordings for this project were done by myself on a Zoom with no mic. And then Ben listened to that. He was like, no. Didn't you notice that there was music playing in the restaurant? And I was like, no, I didn't even think about that. When I met up with him, it was September 2018. And then it was, within 6 weeks, there was a suspect in custody who was a suspect in a series of armed burglaries, not yet an overtly stated suspect in the murder.
Right.
Previous shootings. So that, that's this journey that I've been on ever since. And just to answer your last question about the piece that was in the magazine. So then I kept talking to my editor at the New Yorker about what I was learning in the course of reporting the podcast. And I would talk to David Remnick about it too, back in the days when you could just kind of go to New York for a work meeting. It's been a while. But he would ask, how's it going and what's happening? And then everybody, luckily for me, thought that it would be a satisfying magazine story at that stage. Once I'd learned, a couple of years in, when it wasn't just the, oh my gosh, a total whodunit. It was actually a little bit more to kind of feel like a complete magazine story while still leaving a lot of space for there to be a podcast that came out around the same time. So
yeah. Oh, that makes sense. And I mean, it's always hard to talk about great timing in terms of these stories that are centered around a tragedy and, awful circumstances. But in a way, you were well positioned by getting ready for this that summer, so that in the fall, you had your audio partners and you were ready to produce this when developments really started happening. From the work perspective, that was good timing.
Yeah. When something is happening in this immediate kind of urgent and acute way, that's one of the things I love about doing the kind of work I do, where you can just jump in the car, if it's a local story, with a reporter's notebook and kind of, tuck your way into different situations and start gathering the material. A lot of the work I do for the New Yorker is different. When I'm writing a profile of an architect or something like that, I have to be ready to get in my car and go, whatever the story is. But this was a little different. This was dealing with law enforcement. This is dealing with people who don't want to tell me what's going on because they're trying to figure out what's going on. So I would kind of show up at these manhunts that I heard about that were, I heard that they were going on kind of unofficially. And then I would just show up at the park and, at 10 o'clock at night on a Sunday or whatever it was. I mean, it was a couple of years ago, so I can't remember what day of the week it is if anyone's live fact checking me right now. But I remember a couple of times just saying to my family, like, sorry, you got to go, I'll be back at 2, 4, I don't know.
Right.
Morning, and, I was supremely naive about what that process would be, but I'm really glad that I was, because it made me go into situations that had I known better, I would have thought, don't bother. But I learned a lot just by being there, that's sort of the great lesson of the New Yorker type of education in reporting, is that, just by hanging around a lot, you learn a lot. So I laid the groundwork, and I met people or saw people or had people pointed out to me who years later would turn out to be important to my ability to tell the story.
I want to get into Lost Hills and the plot, but you mentioned that you love podcasts, and that's maybe where that instinct was to say, I think I can almost hear this or, see it as a podcast. What is your own podcast journey? When did you start listening? What was your first show that kind of had that effect on you that made you want more?
I don't know. You probably have like a pie chart of how many of your guests say, season 1 of Serial.
I was going to guess.
But I've loved all the seasons of Serial. And then also, another big chunk of that pie chart would probably be S-Town. And when I heard that, I thought, like, Serial, I just admire the heck out of. Just thought, she's made the journey, the experience of being a reporter so present for people. She's made mystery and not knowing a virtue. And it's just such a fascinating, sort of TikTok story. When I listened to S-Town, I got excited in a whole different way. My literary sensibilities were really engaged by that story. And the idea of being able to really bring characters to life in this medium and to go unexpected places. And I think of that as sort of the best example that I know of the kind of just like kind of the rabbit hole reporting, just like all the space in the world. All you need to do is drop down into that environment, and there's so much story out there. And I felt, as a listener to that, incredibly happy to go along on some red herrings too, just chasing red herrings, like, because they were interesting along the way. And there was a kind of soulfulness and a literary architecture to it. And it felt like being in a novella or something longer than a short story, maybe something shorter than a novel, which is why I said novella. But that kind of, those I feel like are the two, like, that's the mom and dad of my hopes for my podcast baby, is somewhere between those two. But another one that I really, really loved, and I know that you had Steve Hodel on your show, but Root of Evil just blew my mind. And that's
Fantastic.
Where I think that's another influence, just the way of telling an LA story through the lens of the most iconic LA crime, and that it was also a family story, that it was also an art story.
Right.
It had all these elements, and I was just like,
right. And architecture, their iconic home, by the famed architect. It really did have such an LA flavor, as does Lost Hills, obviously. And, I didn't think of S-Town until you said it, but I think your podcast is a great example of a love child of Serial and S-Town, because the characters in Lost Hills, they're real people, but they do serve as characters, and you really let them do the work, sort of. We just get to hear them they're in their natural habitat, right? You were not in a studio. You were not meeting at formal places. You were in offices, with law enforcement. You were on the road in cars, on the streets at rallies. And so you really just get to hear them in their home environment, which I think is very powerful for the listener. So do you think of this when you pitched it? Is it like, this is an investigative piece for a, well-reputed outlet like the New Yorker, or is this a true crime podcast? And I think we're going to capture this whole other audience that maybe we don't even have right now. How did you think about it?
I just felt like story, 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 story. So I didn't think, is this going to be a true crime podcast that can have a more literary kind of flavor and like meander a little bit more? Or is this a literary podcast that's going to be kind of, have some of these sort of investigative elements? I didn't think about it in that way. I did think Malibu Noir. I did feel like, and kind of laughing at myself a little bit, like having read a bunch of the great, especially LA noir short stories and novels, but like laughing at myself as like, girl detective walking into this world or journalist or whatever it is, that outsider. But I just kept kind of finding myself in these situations where I was like, wow, I can't believe I'm like setting up secret meetings in coffee shops with cops. This is so it's not my normal life. And it's got a kind of, there's some genre elements that I really enjoy. And, everybody was like really playing their part.
Right. It's almost like straight out of casting. If you'd wanted to make this an audio work of fiction, it's almost like you had such archetypes of people. Let's talk about the murder of Tristan Baudet, which we learn is it the 8th or the 9th shooting, that there were all these near misses prior. There were attempted shootings.
Yeah, there were 6 near misses, but some of those near misses, the reason you're thinking 8 or 9 is some of the near misses had a couple of people involved, a couple of victims. So because people were in cars, there were often passengers or, somebody else sleeping in the car with the owner of the car, something like that. So yes, for 20 months before Baudet was killed, and even up to 4 days before the murder, there were these shootings, but they followed a very, a kind of odd and a stop and start pattern, and there was a weapon change. So there were lots of elements that were in common among the shootings, and then there were some things that were really confounding and were not common among the different shootings. So the first one that is in the list of crimes that Anthony Rauda is accused of, so we can't really say like the story starts on that day. We don't know. There could be other things. Right. The first of the crimes that he's charged with happens in November of 2016, and it's in Malibu Creek State Park. It's in an area of the park that's really for day use. There's not any official campsite there. People go there to picnic during the day. And there was an experienced wilderness backpacker there's a trail that goes sort of throughout the Santa Monica Mountains called the Backbone Trail. And he wanted to complete the whole Backbone Trail in 3 days, which is pretty ambitious. I think it's like a 67-mile trail, but this is a very fit guy. He worked at REI. He had done like wilderness medicine. He worked for the Wildlife Service. He's done a lot of things at the outdoors. But anyway, he was solo and he didn't feel like going to the campground, which is, where you pay $50 and people are having overnights with their kids and stuff like that. He wanted to just be stealth in and out. He'd hiked 20 miles that day. He was just going to get a couple hours of shut eye and get back on the trail in the morning. So he put up a hammock and he was just sleeping there in his hammock, bundled up in his jacket, then bundled up in the hammock. And all of a sudden he was startled awake, and he described it to me as he couldn't remember having heard the sound, but he remembered the feeling of having heard a sound. He couldn't remember the sound, but he remembered the feeling of having the sound that woke him up, and I kind of relate to that. And his arm was stinging and his jacket was torn open and he didn't know what had happened. He went around into the woods trying to figure out what was going on. And he finally left and he went and got treated for rabies because he thought that maybe, a rabid animal had attacked him. He actually thought that maybe he'd been attacked by vampire bats because he's a biologist. So he's thinking about all the animals that could have done something that looked like what is. And, a few weeks later, he's going like this on his arm, and a metal pellet pops out. And it becomes very apparent that he was not attacked by a vampire bat, that he was shot by a human and using some kind of shotgun ammo. So birdshot is like little pellets or BBs inside a plastic cartridge, and they scatter when the gun goes off. So his arm was just full of those pellets. Anyway, he tried to get information about it. There was very little information forthcoming. And then later on, it would become over the course of the next couple months, there were 2 other shootings in the park, 2 in the campground where Baudet was later killed, also involving shotgun ammo. Then a little more time goes by and we're in the summer of 2017. So there've been 3 shootings all in the park. And then there are 2 shootings on the Canyon Road. Malibu Canyon Road has a name change halfway through and it becomes Las Virgenes. So in the Las Virgenes portion, but right near the park, 2 cars are shot at. So all of these things have in common that they're shotgun ammo. The shootings are between 3 and 5 in the morning, and they all involve a single shot. So that starts to feel like a pattern. But then there's no shooting for 11 months. And then the next shooting is also on the road, but it's not shotgun ammo. Suddenly it's a 9mm bullet, which is, we think of 9mm, you think of handgun. So maybe that's was in people's minds at first. And then law enforcement, because the public didn't know about it, still didn't know about it. We can talk about that in a minute. And then 4 days later, Bodette is killed in the campground with a 9mm bullet. So, and those last 2 shootings, the 6th near miss, and then the murder of Bodette also happened in that same time frame between 3 and 5 in the morning.
Right. So obviously when one of these shootings, this last one with Tristan Bodette, becomes a murder, things pick up naturally, right? Now maybe they're going back to some of these previous people who weren't getting answers and weren't really getting any response almost from the police. So in your opinion, and I know this is fleshed out a bit in the podcast, but just sitting here now, was this a strategy by the sheriff's department, or is this just pure, like, let's keep this as quiet as possible to not invoke a panic among residents?
I think it was Jaws. I think it was, we don't have an answer. Let's not scare anyone. I don't think anyone put this in an email, but this is a tourist town. It's 13,000 residents, as you said, but 13 million visitors. It's a global brand name, Malibu. There's a lot at stake. If it's, the DC sniper, but in Malibu.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. My daughter's like, if this was happening in Central Park, I can't imagine there would not be a citywide alert saying, like, do not go into the park after dark, or that there wouldn't be signs up, about being in there past midnight. Am I wrong? And New York is also, and Central Park too, is fairly, it's a commodity as well.
Exactly. I think that in a sense, the wilderness aspect of this story gave those higher ups in law enforcement who did not want to make a big deal about it, it gave them some kind of cover because, shots in the night, are they connected? I don't know. But to me, where the story really gains momentum when I think about it as an investigative story is that when I learned that there was this small group of people inside Lost Hills Station who said that there is a pattern here and we got to do something about this. And the superiors, the people above them in the pecking order, and Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department is an incredibly hierarchical organization. They said no. And then there was really no avenue for these guys. These guys were then the rogues. But I sort of liken it to, they believed in Bigfoot and everyone was like, what are you talking about? There's just not, there's nothing here. How are you going to prove it? And people hear gunshots in the night in Malibu. Turns out a lot of people have guns in Malibu, but they kept kind of hammering this thing at sort of personal and career risk. Bigfoot's out there, the canyon shooter is real. And it was only when Bodette was killed that finally they had the attention of the people above them that they needed to get the attention of, and said, okay, I guess he's real. These very same people are the ones who tracked down Rauda, who is now accused of the crimes. And there's just a profound irony to the whole situation. And they've also lost they've either lost or their careers have been very damaged because the department, I think, in some way can't deal with the fact that they were right and they were sounding the alarm early and often, and they kind of have the goods on their bosses in that way.
Oh, man. So can you talk a little about the distinction between this Lost Hills Sheriff Station and LAPD? Because they're outside of Los Angeles Police Department, right?
Correct. So Los Angeles Police Department, their jurisdiction is the city of LA. The county of Los Angeles is much bigger than the city of Los Angeles. And Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, their jurisdiction is all of those county places that don't have their own police departments. So, LA is such an odd shaped urban environment. You think of West Hollywood as part of the city of LA.
Sure.
It isn't. It's its own city. It's a small city within LA County. There's just a group of cities within LA County. City of LA is the largest. And those cities that don't have their own police departments can contract with the sheriff's department, like what West Hollywood does, like what Malibu does. And then all the kind of interstitial parts of the county are automatically sheriff's department. And sheriff's department also is responsible for the jails and the courts. So they have many different roles, and they work, they're colleagues with LAPD, and they will work together on certain cases in certain situations, but it's just a jurisdictional difference. So LAPD has no jurisdiction out there in Malibu or in, the unincorporated area between the city of Malibu, which contracts with the sheriff's department, and the city of Calabasas, which contracts with the sheriff's department.
Wow.
So the Lost Hills station is a sheriff's department station that is responsible for city of Malibu, city of Calabasas, all that wilderness in between, and then a bunch of other places too that are a little bit outside the purview of what we're talking about today. But on this case, there are other agencies involved. There is California State Parks, and the rangers in the park are also sworn peace officers. They have badges and guns too, and they have some investigative powers. They just don't have a lot of manpower. They're not very many of them. So they also didn't warn. By the way, the first 3 shootings, was there anything up in the park? No, nothing. So even when there was a murderer at large, Bodette was dead, there's a murderer at large, I went to the park and didn't see a single sign up there about any of this. And this, the person that is now accused of all these crimes was living in the park.
Right. So Anthony Rauda becomes their perfect suspect. And I think a lot of the podcast listening experience is, did he or didn't he do it, right? We're kind of along with you figuring out if they too conveniently are assigning these crimes to a man who there's no direct evidence, but there's some circumstantial and some placements of him at different periods and robberies that they pretty sure they have him for on video, or if they're just trying to assign this to him, or if he's really the one who did it, because he's certainly unpredictable. And there's, at different points in the podcast, I'm thinking this could be him. Like, this could definitely be the person. And then other times I thought maybe not. Now, where you sit now, we're at episode 7. And when this comes out, there's going to be 8, right? 8 parts?
Yeah.
They'll be all out. So you won't be spoiling it for anybody but me right now upon listening. So do we get to know definitively?
So Anthony Rauda's criminal trial has not begun.
I had a feeling, because COVID, did everything just get delayed?
He continued to have pretrial hearings during that period of COVID. We're still in the period of COVID.
Right.
I've been going to court in a mask and sometimes a face shield for a while. I think things probably did slow down a little bit, and there were certain moments where, someone wouldn't be present because of a quarantine and that kind of thing. So I think it did impact, but it was not one of the things that was put on pause because of COVID. What has been very slow about this case is that Rauda is difficult, and he has been obstructing the forward motion in certain ways, even as he's saying he does not want to waive time. I would say what first happened is that there was just a ton of discovery. He had 7 electronic devices at his camp or with him, and there was a lot to unpack there. And then they had to kind of figure out the theory of the weapons change, and do all of the testing of the weapons and the ammunition. They didn't find the weapon that fired the shotgun ammo. So from Rauda's end, what slowed it down is that he keeps asking to represent himself and then basically not cooperating with his public defenders and alternate public defenders. And I think that has kind of gummed up the works a little bit, I would guess. Sure. I've just been present a lot of times when things have kind of gone off the rails because of that's his wish, is to represent himself. And there's sort of a process that has to get set in motion when somebody says that. The next thing that happened is that the judge declared a doubt about his competency to stand trial because his outbursts had become very disruptive. And so then there had to be an evaluation process, and The most recent thing that happened is that his defense attorney had somebody evaluate him, a psychiatrist. The prosecution has a psychiatrist evaluate him, and this is about the question of can he stand trial, and they differed. They disagreed.
Oh, wow.
So now we have to get, not we, the judge has ordered.
You and I are going to settle this today.
Yes. Now there will be a third expert brought in as the tiebreaker. So, the next hearing is in a couple weeks. Will that report be finished, and will it be determined whether the trial can go forward or whether there's some other process that needs to be initiated if he is thought not to be competent to stand trial? It's just a slow process. So I can only say what I learned and what makes sense to me. He proclaims his innocence, and he deserves a trial to determine his future and his
Absolutely.
fate.
Do you experience digital eye strain from too much blue light exposure from digital screens? Yeah, me too. Baxter Blue glasses are not your average frames. These blue light lenses filter 80% of the highest energy blue light, eliminating 99% of glare. The past year, we have all been glued to our devices more than ever. Between podcasting, watching shows and documentaries for the podcast, writing emails, research, there's rarely an hour I'm not on the screen. Our exposure to digital light has soared, and our eyes and our sleep are suffering as a result. Baxter Blue is also a force for good and provides a pair of reading glasses for someone in need for every pair sold. This is eyewear built for our digital age, and Baxter Blue is giving our listeners 10% off your next purchase of blue light, sleep, or kids glasses. Click the link in our show notes for your exclusive discount. This is the sign you have been waiting for to invest in blue light glasses. We know you will love Baxter's, and we know that you will feel the difference. Again, the link will be in the show notes. Do you have a gut feeling? You have the best look in above anyone else, other than the people working the case.
I can see it. I can see how this could have been him.
Yeah.
I think that there's enough there in his history to explain, to feel like this is an escalation of a pattern of behavior that started a long time ago. The area is not a coincidence. This is his turf in a way, and his complicated and unhappy relationship with law enforcement, and specifically with the Lost Hills cops, gives, I think, if he killed Tristan Beaudet, it was completely random. He did not select Tristan Beaudet as Tristan Beaudet. I think that possibly, I'm really speculating here, but there's stuff to suggest that he might have been trying to create a confrontation with those local cops, that he'd been tangling with people from that station for decades.
Right.
So even though nobody there remembers him, so weird. Don't know why. None of them. They all say we didn't know him, but there were, all the people who are currently there said we never heard about him or knew him. But I can see this as an outgrowth of his feelings, the state of mind that he talks about. What's strange is that his family, who really loves him, I can tell that from his father goes to every one of his hearings that he can, and I think they're really hoping it wasn't him. They really see that there has been a lot of injustice. He has told them over the years about ways in which he's been mistreated by law enforcement, and they've always tried to support him. And this is somebody who, he wants to be alone in the wilderness.
Yeah.
There are so many people all over this country, but I see it a lot in LA. We have an enormous population of people experiencing homelessness, and a lot of them have families who would love to support them in one way or another. Not all of them, of course. But when I sometimes do reporting in that community, I hear about that, I just think about the pain of that family. Their child wants to, their grown child, but Rowda and I are the same age actually, wants to be out there and at great risk to himself and possibly at great risk to others, because it seems like he's at least erratic in his mental health history.
So the mental health history, I'm glad to hear they got this psych evaluation. And if I were to guess, am I right in thinking that the defense says he's incompetent to stand trial and the prosecution is saying he's fine to stand trial?
That's my guess also.
Oh, we don't know.
But they don't know. They
okay.
know. They didn't
disclose that.
They didn't disclose it. But okay. I can tell you that I had a hallway conversation with the prosecutor a few months ago when the judge, on the day that the judge first declared the doubt. And I said, so what does this mean? Explain this to me. And she was like, he's going to stand trial. He's fine. It's going to be fine. She's like, I've only had one person not be able to be stabilized so that they can stand trial.
Right. I think that's a pretty high bar you have to reach to meet that criteria. Yeah. Was that his first formal psych evaluation? That was another question I had, was he, in and out of the system. And you mentioned a system or a program. Actually, I want you to clarify what it is, SSI. Did he not get treated somewhere along the way for anything?
So I don't have access to that. That's all confidential, except where he has sued California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. And as part of that file, there are references. There's one form that I could see that was, and that form talked about PTSD, and that form talked about medication that you can sort of assume was maybe for depression. That form talked about 2 suicide attempts. That form talked about alcohol and marijuana use, which, that who among us? I mean, I don't like that. It would have to be pretty severe, but he did write to me about having blackout, drunk experiences. And I think that may be a bit of a through line, but I don't have any actual diagnosis that I've ever seen for him at any point along the way.
Got it.
Other than PTSD and some depression. But that also feels very, very common in our
universal.
Society.
Yeah.
Universal.
Yeah. Now he cuts off communication with you at some point after really getting quite close and writing letters. Yeah. Does that remain the same to this day?
Yeah, that's the same. I think that in the same way that I never know which route I'm going to see in court. He's a smart guy, not highly educated, but shrewd, I would say. And in the initial letters, I think he was seeing what he could get, how useful I would be. I haven't pestered him with letters after he said, I'm done with you. Because, maybe I'm too inherently non-confrontational, but I also just felt like, he's a vulnerable person. He sees and talks to his father. I think if he wants to engage, he knows how to do it. I guess what I'm saying is throughout the course of the correspondence, he was telling me exactly what he wanted me to know or believe. And at a certain point, maybe it stopped being useful to me because I felt like I understood that narrative that he was presenting to me. I needed to go find the rest of the story that he wasn't.
And do you think he just picked up on that and sort of retreated as a result?
I think that he has pretty profound trust issues. And there's a through line of him talking about other people saying he's paranoid. And so I'm like, so he's been hearing his whole life that he's being paranoid.
Oh.
Or maybe not his whole life, but in his adult life. And I think that I fit into that. And he actually, he told his father not to talk to me. And I think, his father feels very protective of him, but I think feels most of all protective of their relationship. I think, and I'm just guessing here, but sort of an informed guess, I think ultimately the reason his father didn't want to be interviewed is he was afraid that Anthony would break off the relationship, and he knows he's the only reliable person on the outside that Anthony has.
Sure. Understandable. There's a couple other relationships I wanted to ask you about that you develop and people you speak with on the podcast. And one is Tristan Badette's wife, Erica. So I was really glad that you spoke to her because I'm going like, where's his wife? Are we going to hear from his wife? And then we do. And it's clear she doesn't want to talk about the case, the suspect, any of that, but she does want to share a bit of her life. How was that experience meeting her? kind of humanizing and giving more dimension to Tristan as a person? And how did it inform the rest of your work?
Well, Erica didn't want to talk about any of that stuff, partly because there's so much she doesn't know. That's why she filed this claim against the county, and including the sheriff's department and also California State Parks. They really didn't tell her anything, and they didn't. I think the complexity of being in a lawsuit with a $90 million claim for damages is, that's a lot more than somebody who's now a single mother of 2 young kids who works as an OBGYN would typically have brain space for. She's doing that because that's the only way that she can imagine getting real answers from them. These are the people, in her view, who created a lie by not talking about the earlier shootings and not issuing a warning. And that's the only reason on earth that this, highly responsible and well-informed father would take his little kids camping there.
Right.
So I think in a sense, how did getting to know Erica inform my work? I already wanted to know what happened. It was so obvious that there were so many things that just didn't really make sense. Then I felt a little bit also like, she's going to be waiting years for some of these answers because they have to wait until after the RAUDA. It's already been years.
Yeah.
And it's been almost 3 years. And then she has to wait until after the RAUDA trial before her civil claim can be heard. And, some of these things people won't remember exactly what happened in the exact way in a few more years. And I felt kind of impelled by her, just how much she was in the dark. I just thought, if she doesn't know, I've got to, these answers are there. There are people who want to tell what happened. I am in a different position than she is. It can conceivably be my job to go find this stuff out. So I wasn't doing it for Erica, but some part of me also felt like, it is rough to go right in the midst of something so raw and start asking all of these nosy questions and possibly upsetting a lot of people who are already traumatized or whatever, that I felt a little bit kind of, her desire for answers gave me tacitly, we never discussed this, gave me a feeling of kind of moral permission to go into this very raw situation with so much pain. And just because I'm protected from all of that by being an outsider, protected somewhat from it, doesn't affect me. It's not my family, and ask the questions. But I also, because I'm interested in character, I wanted to know who this person was. He sounded like an incredible person, Tristan Beaudet. And every conversation I had about him deepened that feeling for me. And I didn't want him even to, also sort of morally, but for the sake of the story, I didn't want him to be just a paper cutout victim. I wanted him to have the depth, at least a little. I wish I could have his voice in the story. But early on, I asked about recordings, and there just really weren't any that anyone was willing to share with me anyway. But I wanted to bring his character to light and to life as much as I could.
Well, she was a really beautiful conduit to do that. She was a perfect person, and I thought it was really brave of her, and I really commend her for talking to you. I think it added a lot to the story. Did you consult with LAPD about the Lost Hills sheriffs? I mean, is that appropriate? I don't know, but did you get any insight from other people in law enforcement as to their strategy or the way they were handling this case and keeping so much of that quiet? I
talked to a lot of retired and some current sheriff's deputies who actually, the thing that's odd about this is that there are those at the sheriff's department who believe that the small core of people who were trying to sound the alarm are in the wrong.
Right.
And this culture is so strange. So I think ultimately from all of these interviews that I've done, one of the sort of avenues that is it's compelling to me, and it's bigger, it's way bigger than this one tragedy, is what is important to this law enforcement organization. It's maybe not surprising to your sophisticated audience, but it's just self-protection is ultimately the the goal here. I mean, they're empowered to protect the citizenry with their guns and badges and investigative powers. But if they do anything wrong, the desire to protect the institution is ultimately, seems to me to be the highest good of this place in their own view. So, what happens when you have dedicated, long-term employees of an organization like this trying to do what you think of a cop's job as being, then getting punished for it because of the politics involved? Because if these local guys at Lost Hills, some of them, if they wanted to warn and they said that and they put that in writing and they took those meetings and they had those conversations, then when Erica Wu files her lawsuit and says, I'm accusing the sheriff's department of not warning, of failing to warn, and then the sheriff's department has to go call the local station and say, hey, did anyone over here try to warn? If there are a couple of guys who say, yeah, we tried to warn, then all of a sudden that's a liability for the sheriff's department. And what do you know? What happened to those guys? They were well-respected, decorated members of this law enforcement organization. Suddenly they're under internal investigation. They're kicked out of Malibu, their sort of home station. They're punished. It's a pretty terrifying lesson that they might be worse to each other than whatever the public's view of being worried about encounters with law enforcement. They're also treating each other in a way that is not, does not create a healthy culture, I guess I would say.
Right. And that often comes at the expense of civilians and citizens.
Yeah. If you had people in this instance saying for, about a year before the murder, longer than a year, saying, hey, first, when the 3 shootings happened in the park does nothing that we know of. Park is completely shut down, won't say anything about anything. But one thing I do know happened is that someone in a pretty high up role at the park called over to Lost Hills. Lost Hills is about 5 miles. The station is about 5 miles from the park. These guys patrol there. It's co-jurisdiction. I mean, they are not strangers to each other. Half of them surf together. I mean, it's a community. And someone calls over to Lost Hills Station to Lieutenant James Royal and says, hey, there have been these 3 shootings. Could you guys kind of take a look and see what's going on? And so he thinks, yeah, this is weird. They all happened, single shot, shotgun shell, same, 2 of them right in the same part of the campground. One of them not in the campground, but an overnight camper, between 3 and 5 in the morning. Yeah. Let me try to get some interest. Let me tell the then captain station, starting then and then all the way up to the murder and going all the way up the chain of command, as really high up the chain of command, to be told, no, we're not going to warn. And then after the murder, to have that same guy force him to stand in front of the public at a town hall meeting and say, these aren't connected. Mm. It's pretty scary to think that, it's scary to think of an unpoliced, beautiful state park where you want to go hang out with your friends and family. It's scary to think of stuff happening in the dark out there and on a dark road in Malibu. It's really scary to think of the law enforcement in the area lying to people about it.
Well, you know what this is reminding me of? I don't know if you knew about this story prior or encountered it while reporting, but the Mytrice Richardson case. Are you familiar? Because that was the Lost Hills Sheriff again.
It was Lost Hills Station, and I knew about the story just from being someone in LA, reading the paper and stuff like that. I've lived here already in 2009 when that happened. And there was a lot of coverage of it locally then. But I think that Tristan Beaudet's murder really rekindled interest in that story and outrage over that story. So a lot of my reporting on Beaudet and Rauda brought that up for people. So I am going to do the second season of Lost Hills will address the Mytrice Richardson story.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah.
That's a case. That is a haunting one. Now, I would think there's not what's the turnover like? Are some of these guys players in that story? Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm just taking that in. Okay. When can we expect to hear that?
I am hoping that we'll be able to do a kind of mini season just about my trees by mid-fall.
Oh, nice. Okay, good.
That's the hope.
And her family, I think, was in a civil suit with them as well.
Mm-hmm.
They might have even won.
There was a settlement.
There
Yeah.
was a settlement. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back to just one thing you said when they couldn't identify the weapon that the bullets came from, because is it episode 7 where you're re-examining some photos from the crime scene and you recognize potentially the device. Can you talk about that moment and what you saw?
So the theory about why they never found a shotgun, the prosecutor's theory about why they never found the shotgun that was associated with the first 5 near misses, the shotgun ammo shootings, is that it was an improvised weapon. So something that the perpetrator made. And one of the most common ways to make one of these kinds of DIY weapons, which they call zip guns, is out of pipes and nails, basically. And in the grand jury testimony, the prosecutor has investigators from the sheriff's department testify to finding pipes and nails at the campsite where Rada was arrested, which is, an informal campsite up in the hills behind the sheriff's station, but actually part of the state park, and finding the shells from the shotgun, some shells from the shotgun ammo that had markings on them that indicated that they had not been fired from a manufactured weapon. Okay. So that looked essentially like they had been hit with a nail to ignite the primer on the back and, create the explosion that is gunfire. So, the zip gun theory answers the question of the single shot because it's not a regular shotgun. It's not easy to reload. It's not, it maybe answers the question of why a shotgun was never found, why there wasn't one at his camp. There with metal detectors and they did not find a shotgun. And why they found these weird shells and these pipes and nails, but they don't have the completed zip gun. So this is, to me, just a big problem with the case. I mean, the prosecutor must be pretty confident that to include all those shootings when she doesn't have the weapon. But I think it's circumstantial, essentially. Without a witness to it also, if no witness, no weapon, that seems like a problem. But at least a public perception problem. We can just leave it at that. It's a hole. And so I had met someone who knew where Rada's camp was. And I saw it from the air, but getting there on foot is tricky if you don't know where you're going. And as I was getting ready to go out there with him, I was reviewing some photos that he had sent me, just this hiker that I met who knew where it was. And he had been up there a few times, and right before the big fire that tore through Malibu in 2018, the timing of all of this is so also kind of created this sense for people that like, oh, wow, you really just framed a homeless guy because the fire burned up all the evidence. Rada's arrested October 10th, 2018. The Woolsey fire starts not that far from his camp on November 9th, 2018. So less than a month later, it rips through there. It rips through Malibu Creek State Park. It burns, parts of the campground, burns all the way to the ocean. Yep. It's a huge fire. But right before the fire, this hiker that I met had been back there taking pictures. And he sent them to me because we had a plan to go out there, and he said, okay, well, here's what I found out there. It wasn't much, but, we'll get out there when we can type of thing. And all this time goes by. I'm finally just like really studying the pictures after I've read the grand jury testimony and I've read the DA's theory of the zip gun. And so I've started to go down the rabbit hole of what's a zip gun and what do they look like? And I go on the internet and I look at all these videos and I watch all these YouTubers like make with all the guns that they make. And I kind of have, there are lots of designs, but there are also some classic forms. And I'm just flipping through those pictures one more time. It's like a little bit of a blue tarp, a lot of dry leaves. I'm just kind of like, ugh. And then I look at this thing that's this picture, a bed of dried leaves, and then a piece of wood that looks like a 2x4 that's been carved up into this kind of puzzle piece shape. And I instantly see that that is a shape, a weird shape that I've seen time and time again online and in these books that Rauda had at different points in his life, because I've amassed my own personal collection of like the books that Rauda had in his life, and it looks just like the frame to a zip gun. So it can't be proved. I took the picture, just thought it was interesting, but obviously didn't think it was a clue because he was out there looking for clues and he didn't ever do anything with this. The fire came through there, probably burned it up. So this picture is all that's left that I know of. And it's unmistakably something suspicious looking.
It's not a natural debris or part of the surroundings. It's just not.
It's not a natural thing. It is from a man-made piece of wood, and then it's been further manipulated with these cuts where you can see like that could be the grip. That could be where the barrel goes, the pipe barrel.
Wow.
That could be, you can see how this thing could complete the picture of the zip gun that they never found. And for me, this is about not, this could be admissible as evidence in the case against Rauda. For me, this is about the case against the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, who combed through that site repeatedly and missed it. And they already thought they were looking for a zip gun, but they are not necessarily trained to see this. If we're talking about the homicide detectives, they're looking for a gun. And their metal detectors are not going to alert on this piece of wood.
Sure.
It's basically the same color as the dry dead leaves. But the hikers noticed it. Like, if you already know you think this is the guy, and you know that you think you're looking for a zip gun, and you still can't see this, maybe it kind of was like a microcosm of how so many people at the sheriff's department couldn't see that there was a problem out in Malibu to begin with.
Right. That was a big moment for you. I mean, I felt it.
I was terrified. I felt terrified seeing that. I felt like I'm not equipped to be noticing this. I'm not the one supposed to be seeing this.
Or maybe you were. I mean, maybe somebody needed to see it, and maybe the somebody's you. I don't know why, but it was a scary feeling. Like, I don't want to know, even if I'm wrong, they still should have taken it for evidence. Yeah.
Even if it's not a frame of the zip gun, they should have taken it for evidence. But I felt, and I still feel, alarmed by that. Like, wait, it's all so arbitrary and random. Like, how does anything get solved? Like, This hiker took a picture, then the fire came through, and I looked at the pictures a bunch of times, and I finally looked at the pictures again, and it kind of could mean something. But it also, it's very disturbing to me, but it also is kind of, at the same time, it kind of gives me faith in the storytelling process and the reporting process, that with enough looking, things can make sense. If you spend enough time, if you do enough research, if you look hard enough, if you look again and again and again, sometimes things will click.
I think that's what I mean. I don't want to diminish your fear around it, and that feeling and that reaction you're having, that makes total sense. I guess I mean, that maybe was your job that you didn't sign up for. It's like you doing that could be a witness to maybe just expose that they missed it. I mean, it is not a smoking gun. It might be the frame of a zip gun, but it's not a smoking gun.
And it's not a physical object. If the guy had handed me this physical object, that would be different.
Sure.
It is a, it's meta.
Yeah, very. Oh man. So is the name Lost Hills, honestly. Well, this is fascinating. I can't wait to see what you put out next. Do you think podcasting will be a medium you continue in? You're going to do a small series on Mitrice Richardson, but beyond that, do you think this is something you want to keep doing?
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely more in this exact area that, the sort of the mini Mitrice season. And then there are a bunch more stories that I want to tell involving Malibu and law enforcement and Lost Hills and going deeper back in history.
Oh, cool.
When I come up for air from that in a year, let's talk again and I'll tell you what I'm working on. But I love this way of telling stories. I feel really lucky to have kind of blundered into it out of it as just a fan, basically a fan who, you know, has a reporting and a writing background, but not an audio background at all. And lucky for me that I found people who know what they're doing.
Well, lucky for us too, because Lost Tales is a fantastic podcast. Before I let you go, I just ask all my guests before they leave, what gets you up in the morning?
I have a dog who literally jumps on my bed and starts licking my face.
That's a pretty good way to wake up, depending on the hour.
She wants to go on a walk, and I usually try to make her wait until the local coffee shop opens so that I can walk her to the coffee shop.
Nice. Well, Dana, thank you so much for being on Dialogue, and I look forward to your next works and keeping in touch.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to you.
Likewise.
A duck blind on Reelfoot Lake in northwestern Tennessee becomes the unlikely site of a double homicide. Then the suspect's body is discovered floating in the murky waters nearby to the scene of the crime.
Maya Miliete goes missing from Chula Vista after a fight with her husband, leading friends and family to believe he might be involved.
Tune in to Murder News, the Listen Edition, every Friday for the biggest true crime cases making headlines each week.
Subscribe to Murder News, the Listen Edition, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Murder News.
Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production edited by Jason Usry and produced and hosted by me, Rebecca Sebastian. Please be sure to subscribe to Dialogue, a true crime conversation, wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across all platforms. You can also drop me a note or a guest suggestion or sign up for my newsletter at RebeccaSebastian.com. Be sure to join me every Wednesday for a new episode and another killer conversation.